Hi guys, Andy N, Spoken Label, back in the house on a Sunday morning as well. I'm tired today. I was up editing last night, the podcast to do with Amanda, so I won't be flying on all cylinders today, but I've got a fantastic writer with me today, all the way into France now. And I'll let Karina explain in a minute. She's originally from the Malta area and also been living in Luxembourg as well. And I came across her work, and it was either on SoundCloud actually or Instagram. I've forgotten which one it was. And I got in contact with Karina. I really want to chat to this lady for a couple of months now, so I've been looking forward to this. Karina, first of all then, would you like to tell people a little bit about yourself? Tell us, obviously, I know you're from Malta originally, and tell us about where all your creativity came from, including your writing.
First of all, Andy, thanks so much for having me here and for this invite. Yes, I'm originally from Malta, so great chunk of my life was spent there, surrounded by the sea in the middle of the Mediterranean. But 8 years ago, I moved to Central Europe and I started working in Luxembourg. So I lived there for around 5 to 6 years. And then I moved to France, to the Moselle area, which is very close to where I work, so it's easier. And of course, there's also the duality about this, because coming from an island, it's a big step when coming from a really small island in the Mediterranean, and suddenly you're in the middle of Europe. There's a totally different perspective, and it has opened a great deal of point of views, opportunities, and inspiration as well, for sure.
Yeah, we were talking about this off camera before, and this I found particularly interesting. I was like, obviously, like you said, you've lived in 3 different countries now. Do you think living in each country has changed your creative outlook and the way you look at your work in general?
I must say that probably yes, definitely. Because coming from Malta, although there's a huge pool of people who are very artistic and very creative, and there's a lot of inspiring details and concepts that I find, like in the landscape, for example. When I came to Luxembourg and France, in my case, I have an environmental background, not just a literary one.
Yeah.
So for me, already the landscape, it's a different aspect. It's there are more forests than the sea. So it opened up to me a whole different world. It gave me also the opportunity to come across the languages, which of course they started also enriching the way I write, and certain words and concepts that I started to introduce in my writing that took it to a different level as well.
Yes, I can see that straight away. Your work, that's 2 ways I can talk about it. I want to talk first of all, before we go into your work. Your work is very, very distinctive straight away. But also tell us about, since you've hinted at it, about your environmental background. Because this is what one thing I found really interesting, because I'm getting interested in this sort of field myself at the moment. I want to learn about your background. And tell us about your environmental background and first next.
I was always very interested in the environment. I think it started actually when we were really young. I must say that promotion and education really worked out, because at school there was and in society there was a mascot we used to call there. It was like a very personified way of pushing us to take care of the environment, and I started believing in that and wanted to study it. So first I started with geography, and then later on I moved to sustainable development. I was very interested in different countries, different perspectives, the multicultural aspect of it, and the effects. Mostly it's about the effects. That's what I want to bring in now, and even more hopefully in the future, into my writing. The effects of the environment and our relationship to it. How we integrate ourselves into the environment, and vice versa, how we live in it. So that is a very strong aspect. And also I had the opportunity to work for several years in the environmental sphere in Malta, together with NGOs, both as paid work because I have to live, right? And
We
at the
all
same
do,
time,
don't we? So
we all do. And on a voluntary level, which was something which I really enjoyed passionately.
yeah, interesting, really, because you can see it with your work actually. Because I'm going to quote what is on your website here, and you're going to explain this a bit more detail to us. And I can see you're in a lovely environment with your poems where if people look at your website, they will see this statement for yourself, which I agree with. Obviously, first of all, you've been campaigning in favour of a better environment for over 16 years, which is respect for you straight away. But your poetry is really interesting because you've said this, and I agree with this. My poetry is marked by scraps of fragments, teasing rhythms, and subtle colours, at times postmodern and minimalist. And it really is, because it's a really interesting to read your work. So, where did your writing originally come from?
That's a very good question, and I think it's a very difficult one for a writer because we're placed in a context, right? We're surrounded with different influences. In my case, I find that perhaps two important areas that my poetry comes from, what I draw my inspiration from, is imagination and unrest.
Yeah.
In the case of imagination, it's I have to ask questions. So I have to see, as a writer, you feel that as well. You have to visualize a different world. You start asking questions. You don't take things for granted at all. And suddenly you start imagining different spaces, how a world could be, even if it's a tiny world, a small plant or a landscape or a country. And at the same time, in my case, I feel that there's an unrest. It's like there's a space through which I would like to speak, voice what I want to say. It's not a negative or positive space. It needs to be brought out on paper, kind of, in words. So I feel that the push, the drive to write also comes from this. And that's why I look at the environment, at art, and try to bring in these feelings, these emotions, these perspectives.
Yeah, you can see it straight away. And I think it's a really interesting balance with your activism and what you are as a person, and then sort of poetry, because your work is very, very subtle, and it's beautiful for the subtleness where you hold back. I found it really interesting, the fact, like, I noticed you've undertook an MSc in sustainable development at the Imperial College, and get this right now, and SOAS, and is it SOS University?
Yeah, even for me, I find it a bit.
Yeah, it's perks of being dyslexic there, because we'll read things completely back to front. So, no, definitely that. Now, I know it's at the moment you obviously are working currently on your first poetry collection, aren't you? So what direction is this going to be going?
I feel that slowly I'm building this material, this volume of work, and I can already see 3 to 4 distinct areas. So I also visualize that perhaps my first collection would also steer towards these different areas, these different sections. For example, I write nature poetry, which is subtle. It speaks about nature, it speaks about landscape, it speaks about seascape as well. Like a while ago, I was writing about tuna and the role of fish in the sea and the contribution they make. So that's less political, I would say. It's a more of nature writing.
Yes.
And then there is the aspect of an environmental, social, political writing, which is more direct and questions the impact we are having on society, the political impact on over construction, over consumption, the influences we have on migrants and on the world around us. And then there is an aspect which is more, I would call it perhaps being human. The fact that of course, I touch upon in a different way about love, about interactions with people, bringing in jazzy and rhythmic kind of alliterations, assonances, so that I bring in a certain parallelism in the writing itself. So I see that it's the evolution is steering towards this kind of roots, let's say.
Yeah, yeah. And I think I'm always a believer as a writer, is your work's got to be constantly evolving anyway. And who knows, like you said, if you've got 4 directions it's going in, it might end up being, who knows yet, 2 or 3 books. You don't know, do you? So
True.
I think it always will develop at its own pace anyway. Now, I want to ask you next about when you obviously got a high commendation for the Ledbury, get my words right today, get my tongue out. Ledbury Poetry Competition in 2022. A poem called, and I'm going to pronounce it horribly wrong. Is it Habiba? Is it? Have I got that right?
It's Habiba.
Habiba, nowhere near.
Habiba. But it's very difficult to say because
Yeah.
it's got the H, which is a very particular sound also in the Semitic language, and it's written. Well, first of all, I chose the name because it means friend. In
Right.
Maltese, it means friend, Habiba, like Habib, like it's a very Arabic, Semitic word.
Yeah.
So I focused on the very fact that the struggle of migrants, the struggle of migrants when they come to shore to Malta, sometimes it's their first port of call. And I wrote through the eyes of a migrant. I was a volunteer for a decade with the Malta Red Cross at the time. So at all hours of the day, Andy, we were called to assist migrants coming on shore at 4, 3 in the morning. We had to work with the police, etc., and to try to coordinate things and be supportive. And I encountered this firsthand. So for me, it meant a lot, especially for a woman coming after a tough journey and being checked out by the medics in a situation which is really unpleasant. So it struck a chord there with me. So, and I kept it in mind and developed, like you said, developed the writing slowly into a poem.
Yeah, yeah, no, of course no, excellent. Well done for that straight away. Now, I want to do a sidestep now, because obviously we were talking about your hobbies and interests before, and I'm very interested in learning, does this cross over? Because if people look at your website, they will see you like dabbling in calligraphy. So tell us about your interest in calligraphy then. And has this crossed over into your poetry yet?
Let's say it started because of my mother. My mother
Oh,
loved to. She was a very very good seamstress. She loved crafts and she introduced me to calligraphy.
right.
I speak a lot. Also, I speak a lot about my mother in different aspects in my poetry because she passed away almost 18 years ago. So that was a very tough time as well. And
Yeah,
as you can imagine, somehow there is a crossover from that as well into the poetry. And yes, and calligraphy, but I think it's still in its infancy in a way. However, I like the fact that, Andy, as you know, we write a lot online and we use a lot the computer. And actually sitting down and starting writing calligraphy with a pen and ink, there's a connection, with the
yes,
brain.
yes, of
There's a
course.
connection. It's a very tactile aspect, and I quite like the the way calligraphy flows and the fonts themselves. It's a very particular, but I must admit, not necessarily, it hasn't necessarily crossed over yet completely into poetry per se. So that is, I can take a hint from there and
Who knows? I'm not good.
explore it.
People look at your website, they will see one of your other interests is a slave to chocolate. So I don't think that's crossed over to your poetry either yet. Or particularly when you love wine as well, definitely so. No, okay. Looking forward then to start winding down this section. Do you have any ideas where you want your creativity to go next then?
I think in my case is I'd love to finish this BA I'm doing in English literature and philosophy, because I'd like to wrap that up so that kind of seal that, and because that was something I wanted to work on to develop also my writing.
Right. I wasn't sure if you're still carrying that on, because it's sometimes you look at websites, you can see mentions in it. I thought it'll come naturally, but tell us about that then. Go on then. So.
I always felt that I wanted to write since I was young. I studied English at sixth form, but I didn't take up the English language or creative writing path at the time. I focused on geography and sustainability. And then later on, like about 5 years ago or 4 years ago, I said, why not? I think I'd love to improve the creative side more. So of course I needed to read more. Definitely, I cannot just and it's beautiful because you get to know so many people and so many writers, and old classics and new ones,
Oh yeah, yeah.
and it opens up a whole world. So even the contemporary ones like yourself and Joelle Taylor, and even, let's say, old ones, like I was very much inspired with T.S. Eliot and Dorothy Molloy, the Irish writer, and Rosemary Tonks. They gave me a good base. But I love contemporary writing because it's so real, you know, it's so now. So
It's of the
then I
moment,
said I need to focus on something more academic to give me that foundation.
Yeah,
In the
of course.
meantime, I feel that it's going to, the next step is focusing on the collection, bringing all together, everything, the material that I worked on, kind of unearthing it now and bringing the whole body together. So that's definitely a next step for me.
Well, fingers crossed you get that done next year or two, definitely, because I certainly would love to read a copy of it, because after playing your SoundCloud page a couple of times this morning and yesterday, I was spellbound by it. I thought, absolutely tremendous stuff.
Thank
So
you.
obviously,
Thank
if people want to find out more about you then, Karina, to wrap up, where do you recommend they go?
I have my website, it's karinafiorini.com, and I have an Instagram profile, which I'm slowly building because I joined Instagram quite late, and it's Karina Fiorini Poetry. And one can also find me on Twitter as well, besides Facebook. But you know, those are the key areas, the key platforms.
Brilliant, great stuff. And obviously, I'll make sure to put a link on the SoundCloud page as well, because people should hear that straight away. So, but anyway, then, so we'll wrap up part one. So, thank you for this, Karina. Hang around because you're going to get a treat in a few minutes. I look forward to hearing what poems Karina's going to do for us. See you all in 2 minutes.